We'll go ahead and get started with our agenda meeting. Immediately following the agenda meeting, we have a work session. In that work session, like I said, we'll begin immediately following, and it'll be on zoning and our zoning code. So we're going to review the action items that will be formally addressed next Tuesday evening, October 3rd. We're already in October, and the New Year's coming fast. And that'll be at 6 p.m. right here at City Hall in the board chambers. And I'll call upon Mr. Bill Burrow, our city manager, for those review of those action items.
Thank you, Mayor. As one of your guests of that meeting, we'll have Gary Troutman, President and CEO of the Greater Hot Springs Chamber of Commerce and Hot Springs Metro Partnership. He will be here to deliver the economic development report that he does each month. Under your first item on the consent agenda is Resolution R23-162. A resolution acknowledging receipt of the City of Hot Springs financial statements for August 2023, and our Finance Director, Karen Scott, will present the item.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Board. As you know, the monthly financial statements are issued to keep city management and constituents apprised of the financial condition of the City of Hot Springs. The August 2023 financial statements will be provided as an attachment to the board action request, and staff recommends acknowledging receipt of the August 2023 financial statements.
Any questions of Ms. Scott? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have Resolution R23-163, a resolution approving the City of Hot Springs Historic Commission bylaws, and our Planning and Development Director, Kathy Selman, will present.
Thank you. Hot Springs Code, Section 16724, describes the duties of the Historic Commission and notes that it is authorized to formulate and adopt design guidelines and adopt bylaws to govern their proceedings subject to the approval of the Board of Directors. And the Historic District Commission has duly advertised and then met on September 21st, 2023 to consider their agenda, which included proposed bylaws. By their unanimous 5-0 vote, they adopted, subject to approval by the Board of Directors, the proposed bylaws to govern their proceedings consistent with their responsibilities in Hot Springs Code 16-24.
Any questions of Ms. Selman? Director Webb?
Thank you, Mayor. When you said they voted to adopt the bylaws, were these bylaws created by a separate entity and then kind of picked up by the City of Hot Springs Historic District Commission, or were these bylaws created by the commission
They
and
were
then formally
created
adopted?
By the commission. The basis of these bylaws was their previously adopted bylaws, which contained certain things that needed to be corrected. For example, it noted a previous number of commissioners that no longer applied to our current commission.
Were they just outdated,
it was
for
outdated.
lack of better words?
Yes.
And will this new adopted bylaws be included in our packet?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Any additional questions of Ms. Selman? Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Along with the adopted bylaws, would any of the previous bylaws be included, or would we know what was amended if any amendments took place?
What is in the packet at the moment is a clean copy of the new bylaws. If you believe that you need to see the old ones, we could add those, I'm sure.
Okay. I don't know yet, but
Might as well
Thank
go
you.
ahead and add them.
Okay.
They should be on the website, but might as well put them in a packet, that way they're handy for you.
These bylaws are, I assume there's going to be a state statute that provides some direction on that, or do you just,
There is.
yeah,
Yes,
and so they have to stay within the state statute?
we do. And that is ACA 14172, 201, and then throughout that section that governs exactly what our district commission can do.
Correct.
Yeah, so those are the approval guidelines, there are also some procedural guidelines, much like the board has with respect to motions and quorum and the like.
Very good. Any additional questions? Thank you.
Your next item is Resolution R-23-164, a resolution authorizing the mayor to execute a contract with services between the City of Hot Springs, Arkansas and Garland County, Arkansas for information systems, IS services, and our Information System Director, Jeff Winter, will discuss the item.
Good afternoon, all. So, as most of you are aware, we've had this contract since 2009. This is just a renewal of the same. We do this on a biannual basis, so every couple years, but in the contract, which will be in your packet, it is subject to budget approval every year by the city and also the county, and there's outs for them every year. Just so you're aware, it covers most of the cost of three employees, and then partial cost for myself and another employee. But we do recover, 100% of the money that we spend in time and effort for them. Where it's beneficial for them is, and this has been ongoing, is whenever they have, like right now, we're short 2 employees. So we're out 2 employees of the 6 technicians that we have. But when those folks are gone, if the phone rings, we answer it whether it's city or county. And so, like I said, it's mutually beneficial when we're short people, and then when they're short people, or when we have times where they're, like I said, super busy, and we can add that extra manpower to that. Another benefit of this contract long-term is that we have much greater buying power. So a lot of software and contracts that we issue, instead of buying 400 for the city and the county would have to buy their 400, we buy 800, and there's a lot of breaks at 5 to 100 to 1,000 a lot of times. So there are a lot of benefits to this. We do have generally a quarterly meeting with a couple quorum court members. There's an IT committee at the county where they basically evaluate this and talk about this several times a year, and all the elected officials have the opportunity to come if they have any questions or concerns. And I will generally say that they've been happy with the service that we've provided. So any questions from y'all?
Very good. Any questions of Jeff? Thank you.
Next, we have Resolution R-23-165, a resolution awarding a bid to Golden Standard Construction LLC for Kimberly Park concession stand building renovations and certain baseball field improvements in the amount of $452,012. We'll say this is included in your 2023 budget, and our Deputy City Manager, Denny McFate, will present.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows, members of the board. As Kimberly Park Sports continues to grow, the concession stand building has not had any substantial work done to it in recent years and is in need of various upgrades and improvements. Plans were developed to expand the width of the concession stand building kitchen by approximately 5 foot 7 inches. The full width of the building, an electric griddle and commercial vent hood will be added to the service area, and all counters and major appliances will be upgraded. There currently is no heating and air conditioner in the building, with the exception of one HVAC unit inside the concession stand area. As part of the renovation, 5 new mini-split HVAC units will be added, along with 2 electric heaters throughout the building. An internal restroom will be added in the remodeled office space. All interior walls, exterior walls, and ceilings will be painted. The floors will be epoxy sealed. All exterior doors and windows will be replaced. There will be 8 new dugout slabs poured, moving the current dugout locations to the 3rd baseline. 3 new 15 by 35 foot 7 metal shade roof structures, including slabs, will be installed at locations where either we do not have benches existing, or there's a bench there that doesn't have shade cover over it. Bid invitations were sent out to 419 vendors for the Kimberly Park concession building and these field improvements, with 1 bidder responding. Golden Standards Construction LLC of Trascoot, Arkansas was the only responsive bidder, meeting the specifications. So therefore, staff recommends awarding a contract to Golden Standard Construction LLC of Trascoot in the amount of $452,012. And like Mr. Burrows said, it is in the 2023 budget.
Very good. Any questions of Denny? Yes, Director Webb.
Thank you, Mayor. Do we have any breakdown on what the cost is for the concession stand renovations versus what cost is incurred for the baseball field improvements?
Yes, sir. I can be
I
sure.
know
I
that-
think that's in the packet.
It's in the packet. Okay, the total's $452,012. Would it be safe to say that it's half and half, or would it be one side get more than the other?
We did alternate deducts when we put the bid out because we wasn't sure that it was gonna, we were hopeful it would come in within budget, but just in case, there were 2 alternate deducts. The concrete slabs for the dugouts were $4,500 each. And the other alternate deduct was for the shade structures, and they were $41,642 each.
And were there eight slabs you were saying?
8 for the dugouts, yes, sir, and 3 for the shade covers.
Would that be all the cost then for the baseball field
Yes, sir.
improvements?
Yes, sir.
Do we have any way, and I get like both of these renovations taking place at Kimmery are both coming from the same construction company, right? Golden Standard?
Yes, sir.
Do we have any way to split this resolution so that we've got half for the concession stand and then half for the baseball field?
I don't think so.
Why is it both together?
That's the way it was bid, and we had alternate deducts, so someone that was interested in bidding a portion of that could have. But out of 400+ vendors, we had one vendor that submitted a bid. And again, you know, it's very difficult to get anyone to bid on some of these projects, especially if they're this small. A couple of the things that the board needs to be aware of. One is the concession stand has been needing improvements for years. That's why we got it in the 23 budget. When you go out there, we're trying to have umpires and those that are managing the complex. They're basically working out of a storage building that has mop buckets and everything in there with them. There's just no room. The dugouts are made of wood. They have to be refurbished at some point. We're trying to move those down to the third base line. Put in some of the metal structures for the dugouts. Some areas we have no bleachers, and in an area where we have a bleacher, it doesn't have any kind of a shade. So part of this is the improvements all the way through. The dugouts that we mentioned, the bleachers and the shade covers, and then the concession stand. The concession stand to me is the most important, just because of the working environment that they have out there. But I think it all needs to be completed. I mean, Kimmery is our premier park when it comes to sports at this time, so that's one of the reasons we're bringing that to you. And again, it was approved in your 23 budget.
Any additional questions for Denny? Thank you.
Completion is designated for February of '24.
Yep. Next, we have Resolution R-23-166, a resolution approving amendments to the 2023 City of Hot Springs, Arkansas budget. This is primarily an amendment to the budget for the Community Resource Center, and Denny will present this as well.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Burrows, again, members of the board. As Bill said, this was amending the Public Works budget for the operational expenses for things like utilities and insurance for the Community Resource Center, which will cover from approximately a week and a half ago when we closed on the building through the end of December. And there's a breakdown of what our estimated costs are, which is an amount of the budget amendment would be for $60,300 to get us through from now to the end of the year. Along with that, part of the contract says that the church will pay 1/3 of the gas bills, and they will pay the utilities, water, sewer, and electric for the sanctuary building and annex, and the city budget will pay for the electric and utilities for the fellowship hall, which is a 2-story structure.
Any questions of Denny on this item? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next will be your first item under new business, Resolution R-23-167, a resolution declaring a certain structure located at 350 Holly Street a nuisance and condemning same pursuant to Title 17 of the Hot Springs Code, and our Chief Building Official, Mike Scott, will present.
Thank you. Planning and Development Department is proposing condemnation for the purpose of demolishing and clearing a vacant single-family residential structure at 350 Holly Street, which is located in District 1. Based on the condition of the structure poses public health and safety risk. The structure was inspected and deemed unsafe for habitation because of extensive structural damage to multiple areas of the roof, interior ceiling, the walls, and as well as the foundation. Inspectors with the Neighborhood Services Department have met with the owner, Mrs. Barbara Bashirs, and she agrees that the house cannot be repaired and needs to be removed. A notice of condemnation and information regarding the board meeting was hand-delivered to Ms. Bashirs in the planning office. Due to the extent of the deterioration, the inability or unwillingness of the property owner to make the repairs to stabilize and to have no other reasonable alternative, the structure should be raised and removed.
Any questions of Mike? Director Garcia?
Was somebody living here?
I think years ago, it might have been her son, I believe, and maybe some of his friends, but nobody's been living there for quite a while.
Oh,
The house has a spring underneath it right now. The lady that owns it, she lives in the Aristocrat. She walks up there about once a week and she pumps the water out of the basement. It runs constantly. If you get out and you get on the sidewalk, you'll see a hole on the other side of the sidewalk, puddle of water. It's clear enough, looks like you could drink it because that spring just runs constantly. So it's pretty amazing, yeah.
I saw the.
Yeah. It was a nice looking house at one time, really was. It's a shame it
And
got
I
this
saw the
bad.
garbage,
so,
on the first picture
Yeah.
being in front of there. That's why
Yeah.
I wondered if someone was living there.
Yeah, no, not at this time. It hadn't been for a little while, but there was a few years back, I believe. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any further questions? Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, sir.
Next item is your first ordinance of the evening. It's ordinance O-2323, an ordinance approving R2 suburban residential zoning on 1.35 unplatted acres known as 136 through 140 Wayne Place, amending the future land use plan map to designate the area residential suburban and for other purposes. And again, Ms. Selman.
Thank you. The applicant is Mr. Jonathan Martin, and on behalf of the owner, he is seeking R2 suburban residential zoning on this 1.35 acres. It's located generally west of Honeycutt and Chattanooga Streets. Its future land use classification is residential suburban, and it is in Board District Number 1. The parcel has approximately 430 feet of frontage on Wayne Place, and at this time, on the parcel are 2 homes. The zone that they are in, R1, has a minimum lot size of 1 acre each. So with 1.35 acres, it is currently impossible to divide the land to provide a separate lot for each house, which is the owner's goal here. The surrounding property zoning is suburban residential, rural residential, and light manufacturing somewhat to the northeast. Surrounding land use is undeveloped wooded lands, single-family residential, and undeveloped lands. The staff report recommendation to Planning Commission was that they recommend to the board to adopt an ordinance amending the zoning map by designating the property R2 suburban residential because the change demonstrates compatibility with surrounding development and zoning, is consistent with the future land use plan map, and that the change is consistent with the objectives of the zoning code as is required by Hot Springs Code Section 16-11E. Planning Commission duly advertised their September 14 meeting, and after calling for testimony and considering the record, by their unanimous vote, Planning Commission accepted the staff report findings, recommended that the Board of Directors adopt the ordinance amending the zoning map from R1 to R2 suburban residential because it does meet the requirements of Hot Springs Code for a zone change.
Any questions of Ms. Selman? Director Beard?
Can you tell the address again, please?
136 and 140.
Oh, it's on here. What did you said something near Chattanooga?
Yes, I said that the land in question is generally west of Honeycutt and Chattanooga.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions? Director Webb?
Thank you, Mayor. Were there any appeals? throughout this process, or?
Any appeals, meaning
Yes.
someone testifying against it?
Yeah, somebody
were not.
testifying against the approval?
There were not.
Okay.
Any further? Thank you.
And lastly, ordinance O-2324, an ordinance approving CTR commercial transition zoning on .62 acres known as 115 Wind Street, amending the future land use plan map to designate the area commercial enclave and for other purposes. And again, Ms. Selman.
Thank you. The applicant on this is Dr. Carlotta Wells, representing the property owner Southwest Arkansas Foot and Ankle Center. Excuse me. Again, seeking CTR zoning on .62 acres. The subject properties are currently zoned R4, medium-high density residential. They have a future land use classification of residential medium-high, and they are located in Board of Directors District Number 3. The properties are called lots 3, 4, 5, and 6 in Block 1 of Wyatt's subdivision. They have 200 feet of frontage on Wind Street, and Lot 5 is developed with a single-family residence. Lots 3, 4, and 6 are vacant. The property is located directly across Wind Street from the Maury Wyatt Shopping Center, and it is one lot away from the Albert Pike Starbucks, which is just to the north. Surrounding land uses are single-family residential, undeveloped wooded land, multifamily apartment complex, and the commercial shopping center on the other side of the street. Excuse me. The future land use plan map amendment would be required in order to approve this zoning. The recommendation from Planning Commission is that the future land use plan map designate the subject property commercial enclave. The staff recommendation to Planning Commission regarding the zone change was to recommend that the Board of Directors adopt an ordinance amending the zoning map designating the subject property CTR, because Planning Commission can find that the change demonstrates compatibility with the surrounding development and zoning, and that the change is consistent with the objectives of the zoning code as required by Hot Springs Code, Section 16 to 11E. Planning Commission duly advertised their September 14th meeting. After calling for testimony and considering the record, by their 7-0 vote, Planning Commission accepted the staff report findings and recommended that the board adopt the ordinance amending the zoning map and also amending the future land use plan map, because the requested zone change demonstrates compatibility with surrounding development and zoning as required by Hot Springs Code, Section 16 to 11E. And there were no persons who testified against this. The only person who testified was the applicant.
Any questions of Ms. Selman on this final item?
Mayor, that concludes your agenda for the October 3rd meeting. I do want to make the board aware that both Deputy City Manager Spicer and myself will not be here on Tuesday night. We'll actually be at our International City Managers Association conference coming back on Wednesday. I will probably try to zoom in that Tuesday night for the meeting, but Denny will be at the dais. If you have any questions, be glad to answer those for you. But I'm going to try to zoom in for the meeting, but Denny will actually be here in this chair.
Very good. Anything else? We're all good. We'll adjourn this meeting, but stay close because we have a work session that will begin promptly.
Yeah, that's it, that's it. We'll get it started.
Oh my God, that's funny. So it was fun. But I bet you yours is more fun. Oh, we had a blast.
What's more fun?
Oh, I had to go to, I'd already accepted the invitation to an 80th birthday.
That's the goal. That's the goal.
Yeah, she's not 80.
I would have imagined the person from Camaros, because I don't know anyone here. Could maybe just walk away from
They're zooming.
That's who I figured that guy might be.
Bar and good stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, sir. We just finished our agenda meeting, and we've got a couple of members that have stepped out for a moment. Once they get back in, we'll start the work session. Probably in a couple of minutes, about 4:30.
Okay, sounds great. I'll hang tight.
I don't want to sit still. Because I don't know what they're doing.
You're playing video.
Well, I'm imagining share screen. Imagine he's going to be sharing his screen.
That's when it's most important.
Usually very interesting.
Her name's
Yeah.
Megan. She's one of the superintendents in Payette.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Her family's in Stockton. You know how she started her class? Day one, she was playing with the dogs in the background. I suppose this is the one that's the class I'm in.
But you didn't get it.
Denny, you're gonna be at the big chair.
Can't tell because he's the presenter's already.
You don't want to go into Paris.
We ready? Are they taking? We can go ahead and begin our work session on zoning, and I'll kick it off to Bill, and he'll kick it off to Kathy, I guess, and then our guest.
Thank you, Mayor. This is our work session on the development/zoning code. It's something that staff has been working on for several months along with Karamos, and I want to set the stage. This is not a final product. This is the draft of a product that they'll continue to work on over the next several months. They will be coming back to see us live in the room when we're ready to present the final document. I know that it's a rather large document. I think staff has been able to get maybe a third to halfway through the entire product. But we're glad that they're with us this evening to kind of just share. This is more of a status report, I would say, than anything else. But it is moving through. What we've seen so far has been very good work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Selman.
Thank you. This is, as the city manager noted, kind of more of a check-in than an unveiling of a brand new document. So I hope that's not disappointing to you if you were expecting the final project. It is not here. This is the schedule that we have. I know you can't see it. Let me tell you, it's a 20-month schedule. We are in month 8, and we are where we should be according to our contract. So I'd like to thank our partner in Camiros, who has worked very well with us in order to identify areas of things that came up in Forward Hot Springs 2040, which is our adopted comprehensive plan. One of the goals in our community services, facilities, and investment section of Forward Hot Springs, the number one goal in that category was to update land development standards. And I want to take this opportunity to again thank the board for funding in full this project to look at our zoning code. Zoning is kind of the invisible force that shapes our community. You don't maybe know what it is that's out there doing it, but zoning to a great extent shapes what you can do in our community, where you can do it, and how it looks. So it's a very, very key element of the city going forward to update our zoning to make sure that what we're doing with that set of rules helps us to implement what was in Forward Hot Springs. So having told you that this is going to be a very much high level, looking down on the code, kind of a review, I do want to tell you that there is some meaty stuff coming your way, and when that is scheduled to happen. We expect to have a public draft presentation that will be available just after the holidays. So January 2024, we expect to have that public draft that is the actual words, the actual drawings that will help us to implement the goals in our comprehensive plan. At that time, we will look to have some meetings, involve the public, involve Planning Commission, and with their comments, put those together and come up with a second public draft that we expect to have in April of next year. Again, public hearings will follow that, probably in June or July, and the schedule tells us that adoption of a new code should occur in August and September of 2024. Also going on at the same time, we'll be putting together the code manual and doing training, primarily with staff, but also to help us to know how to help people who are doing things that zoning affects, and that's almost everybody, how to interpret the code. We have seen some examples of what will be in the new code, and they are much better at telling people how to do the basics. One of the things that we never had in our code, despite the fact that we have lots of regulations that refer to it, we've never told people how to go about measuring things. So how do you measure how tall something is? Where do you start? What if the building is on land that's, like this? So there'll be lots of illustrations, lots of things that simplify matters that we may have overly complicated in our existing code. And we hope to have a document that will have your support and the support of the community as we move forward to implement our adopted plan. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Chris Jeanette, who is with Camiros. And Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Kathy. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure before I get going. So first of all, just want to say really pleased to be with you all tonight to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing with Code Forward and updating the city's zoning code. This presentation is really going to focus on a lot of the findings from the technical review and approaches report, which has been out for a couple of months now, but that will really be informing what you're seeing kind of coming down the pipe next in terms of the public draft that Kathy just spoke about. So the first thing I want to talk about is why are we doing this work? I'm sure you all have a general idea of why we're doing this work. The number one reason is implementation of Forward Hot Springs, which is the city's adopted comprehensive plan. Really taking the goals, the policies, the vision from that plan and translating those into implementable sort of regulatory tools, techniques, and standards. That's really the number one way that comprehensive plans actually get implemented in communities, working through that translation process and really developing a code that works to make those policies become real. We want to make sure that the organization is as user-friendly, predictable, and consistent as possible. We say predictable because we want to know that outcomes are predictable if you tick all the boxes. And we want to make sure that the application of the code itself is consistent. There should be a level of clarity in here that really kind of removes the need for repeated interpretations and that builds in that predictability and consistency. We want to make sure that we're integrating land use and design considerations into a series of objective standards so that as new development comes into the community, we're really making sure that it's going to meet Hot Springs' high standards for things like design. Enhancing neighborhood character is another key goal, making sure that we're acknowledging unique patterns within varied neighborhoods within the city and enhancing those through the work. Expediting approvals. Things that are logical, things that the city wants to see, things that the city sees again and again and ends up approving. These are things that should not necessarily have to jump through multiple hoops, multiple special approvals or variances. Really looking at sort of those typical logical items and making sure that there are ways that we can expedite their approval. And then finally, increasing the transparency of development approvals so that whether I am an applicant or an observer of the process, I kind of know what to expect. So if I'm an applicant, I know that the steps moving forward are going to be clear and predictable, and if I'm an observer of the process, I know where I can go. Also, just a really important note here on the bottom of the slide, short-term rental regulations are not going to be addressed as part of the overall code update. We know that there are a series of community conversations still happening around those, and they're going to be remaining in Chapter 10, so not dealt with. In terms of implementing Forward Hot Springs, we really want to be looking at a series of kind of modern or emerging uses. So how can we bring up to date the use structure within the code? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some key uses here. The first one of those is this idea of the corner store. We call it the neighborhood commercial establishment because it's not always on a corner. These are buildings that have been part of the fabric of neighborhoods for generations, oftentimes, and that have, unfortunately, in many places fallen into disuse, disrepair, or they've become other uses over time. They may have transitioned into a residential use. The use of a neighborhood commercial establishment would allow those existing structures to come back online and really start serving their community through, low impact, sort of low key commercial uses. Things that are hemmed in with standards around them to make sure that they work harmoniously with the neighborhood environment, but that they're really providing options for people within that neighborhood context. We want to make sure that we're encouraging maker and creator spaces within the city. This could be things like artisan industrial spaces, could be glass blowing or metalworking, specialty food services like coffee roasters, commercial kitchens, which can often serve as sort of important incubator or startup spaces for a variety of businesses that can then transition either into a brick and mortar location or continue as a food truck, which relates to the one right above it. So food truck parks, we know that that's a consideration within the city as well. How do we deal with food truck parks? How do they operate? Where can they be located? And then, we work all around the country, and kind of an unfortunate thing is that we often have to deal with these kind of community uses, more sort of social service oriented uses. These could be things like care homes, residential care facilities, social service centers, children's homes, shelters, and food pantries. So where can those locate? What kind of standards are associated with them to make sure that they can both operate in a way that serves their mission while also complementing their surrounding context? We want to make sure that the code moving forward is addressing a full range of temporary and accessory uses. So importantly, these are all uses on private property. So we're not talking about temporary uses in the public right of way. We're talking about everything that's located on actual private property. So in terms of temporary uses, everything from temporary outdoor events like sales or entertainment, think your pumpkin patch, think your Christmas tree sales lot, to things like mobile retail sales, mobile food sales, or even temporary contractors' offices or contractors' yards that are associated with ongoing construction. So what type of standards are associated with those? What types of timeframes are associated with those? How do we control them in a way that's logical? Accessory uses, again, thinking about a broad range, some examples of those being things like drive-throughs, home occupations in the residential districts, how we're dealing with outdoor sales and display in association with commercial uses, how we're dealing with things like outdoor seating or outdoor activity areas in association with those types of uses. And then another critical one is the accessory dwelling. So we know that these are relatively new to the city, and we're going to be taking a real keen look to make sure that they are both feasible to get built, as well as blend effectively and complement existing neighborhoods. So looking at some potential standards for those, those often might be requirements that a lot has to meet a certain minimum area threshold. We might limit ADUs to just one per lot. Often there could be a maximum size and height associated with an accessory dwelling unit that's related to the size and height of the principal dwelling. And then thinking about design standards that might apply to accessory dwelling units. Moving off of uses and now districts. Firstly, looking at the residential districts, we are recommending a modernization of a lot of the controls that are currently applicable within the residential districts. So the first thing that we spent a little bit of time looking at was the front setback. In our analysis, many of the lots within the city aren't meeting existing standards that are in place, whether they be for minimum lot area or minimum setbacks. And many lots aren't meeting the 35 feet or the 25 feet at the front that the current code is requiring. So one of the things that we're recommending is potentially including front setback averaging provision that would allow those lots that aren't meeting the strict letter to potentially come back to performance based on this averaging provision. So you can see the graphic here on the right. If I'm a middle lot, I take basically the front yard average, the lots on either side of me. If I'm a corner lot, it's the two nearest lots, and then that becomes the minimum. We're also proposing to create a specific corner lot setback control. So oftentimes when two front setbacks are applied to anything that faces the street, it can really reduce the width of a corner lot to something that's really not feasible for construction. So creating a specific corner lot setback can often give that amount of flexibility to make sure that we're retaining a buildable width on the corner lot and that we're not precluding those lots from being developed in the future. We want to make sure that we're clarifying setbacks in place that are applicable within the Lakes Area District. This is an interesting one because there are kind of two front setbacks to those lots. There's the actual front setback, and then there's the waterfront setback. So maybe looking at how can we deal with street setback and a waterfront setback to really acknowledge the context there. We want to establish building heights within these districts, kind of across the board, so that it becomes a predictable standard. And importantly, we want to move forward with eliminating FAR, or floor area ratio. FAR was a standard that kind of originated in dealing with much larger scale uses. And over time, it has become applied in a residential context. However, we've found that a lot of the standards that we're talking about, making sure that the setbacks are working, making sure that the lot area minimums are working, building heights, as well as other elements that need to fit on the site, are a much more effective way of controlling the bulk in the area of structures, and they're much more predictable in their outcome. So we're recommending. And then finally, allowing for unique residential forms of development. The one we're going to talk about here is cottagecore. So this is not a graphic that we put together for Hot Springs, just to let everyone know. The scale of this is for a different community, but it's really to communicate the concept here of a cottagecore, which is really a series of smaller structures, smaller footprint, smaller square footage, that are organized around a common feature or central feature. Most often it's some form of common open space. They could have centralized parking or decentralized parking. The idea is that it really allows for building in a little bit of additional density in a gentle way that could work in an infill situation or in a neighborhood context without just putting a bunch of houses on a single one. It's an organizational concept that works really well. It creates a unique space and often fosters a sense of community among the people that live in it. So I want to just kind of quickly move through the overall residential district structure that we've proposed in the technical report. You can see the left-hand column here is the proposed districts. If they're related to a current district, that's listed in the center, and then summarized on the right-hand side. So districts that have not changed very much or that have been retained are in the light gray. And you can use the darker, the bolded ones to kind of see where we've identified gaps within the current residential districts. Just starting up at the top, the RR, Rural Residential District, is related to the current R1, simply been renamed. And then we identified a gap really between the current R1 and the current R2 that we're proposing to fill with the RE Estate Residential District. So this would be a 20,000 square foot minimum lot area district, really designed to address those areas that don't meet the larger rural residential standard, but are significantly bigger than what was required within the current R2 with that. The RN1, Residential Neighborhood 1, relates to the R2, or the suburban residential, would really maintain the purpose of that district. However, we are recommending that the lot area minimum be reduced to 10,000 square feet. During our analysis, we saw that there's a significant statistical difference in percentage of lots that were meeting 10,000 versus those that were meeting 12,000. So 12,000 just seemed a little bit off the mark, a little bit too big. And we could drop that down, increase conformancy, and still sort of maintain the character of those areas. The RN2, Residential Neighborhood 2, relates to the current R3 district. It's a single-family district. It would require 7,000 square feet. Notable here is that we're proposing removing the separate provision that requires an extra 500 square feet for a corner lot. Again, thinking that specifically addressing that corner lot, the corner side setback condition, allow us to address that more. Then two new residential districts kind of sit right in the middle here. The first of them is the RN3, Residential Neighborhood 3. This one is really going to be designed to address both existing areas of small lot single family development, as well as those areas where the city might want to see small lot single family development in the future. One of the things that we heard kind of again and again in conversations with folks when we first started working in Hot Springs was, we need a small lot single family. We don't have an actual small lot single family district. So this is what's proposed here. We don't have a firm number at this point. We're still doing analysis to determine where that should land. But we know that it's going to be smaller than the current R3. Moving down the list, the RN4, Residential Neighborhood 4. This is another new one designed to really transition from single-family districts to more high-density districts that you see further down the list. This would provide also an opportunity for the city to address and potentially build in some permissions for middle-density housing. So things like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-unit buildings that could serve as an effective transition from higher-density residential back down to the low districts. The RN5 district relates to the current R4, really broadly permissive district that allows a variety of dwelling types. This is within the current code, the most permissive residential district. We're proposing one slightly above that at the RN6, be a new district to accommodate a truly dense development pattern. So thinking about like townhouse and multifamily dwellings at higher densities than are currently permitted, where that would make sense, where appropriate within the community. Might not even be mapped right away, but it's a tool that could be used within the future to really implement, again, the policies and the land use goals of the comprehensive. And then finally, the RL Lakes area residential zone. This one, as I mentioned before, would be tailored to the specific kind of intricacies of the lakefront areas, making sure that we're also distinguishing between lots within those areas that are actually abutting the waterfront versus those that don't abut the waterfront, which is a distinction that's currently missing. Moving on to the commercial districts, we're also proposing to modernize and update a number of controls within these areas. So thinking about things like incorporating build-to zones, really moving toward a more urban walkable orientation, specifically where it might apply to really highly walkable areas already, areas like downtown and the central business district. A build-to zone would require a building to locate within a certain distance from the street. So say it's a 0 to 10 foot build-to zone. That means that the front of that building must locate within 0 to 10 feet of lot line. We also understand that a lot of roads within Hot Springs, particularly through commercial areas, are state roads and they're not local roads. So we're taking a keen eye to make sure that we're not going to be building anything in here that's not feasible. And as we move forward, we're going to be again, recommending establishing building heights in all of the commercial districts to really get at that form and predictability that we're looking to establish. And really thinking about the potential to create contextual controls for special areas. So thinking about areas like the CBD, there's a lot going on, right? There are a lot of historic buildings. There are some historic buildings with significant height. There's a variety of beautiful vistas, natural resources. There's topographic change in there. Setting one height control may not be the most sensitive way of dealing with height in an area. So how can we take a little bit more fine-grained approach? Maybe it's a height map, maybe it's contextual controls to really deal with height in a way that's sensitive to the unique conditions of hot springs. Again, recommending to eliminate FAR in the commercial districts as well. And then finally for these, we want to include design standards. So a lot of folks within the community talk to us about how much they love Malvern. If you guys don't know, everybody loves Malvern. You did a great job. What we're proposing is to take the approaches and the techniques that were built into Malvern Ave and disseminate those to sort of the full spectrum of the commercial districts. So everything that worked in terms of that one specific overlay approach could be baked in to the base district standards. So rolling through those design approaches, so they're not specifically applied piecemeal, but that they would become part of the fabric of the way that we're just. So looking at the spectrum of commercial districts here, I'm going to walk through these quickly the same way that we did with the residential ones. First one at the top of the list here is the CTR, Commercial Transitional. It's also the current district. Really looking to add a little bit of flexibility to this one to allow some specific, truly transitional uses to actually function as by right. That's not to say that everything within the zone would be permitted by right. There would still be conditional uses in here that would go through a review process. But the idea is to really work at structuring this with uses and standards that ensure a small scale commercial district that's truly compatible with the nearby residential uses. Moving down the list, the CNC neighborhood commercial relates to the current C3 office/neighborhood commercial. This one's a little bit more nodal in orientation, so it could be close to residential areas, but it's generally a little bit more concentrated, allowing for more non-residential uses that also sort of focus on maintaining compatibility with that residential, that neighborhood adjacency. The next is the CMU commercial mixed use zone. This would be a new one. It would be higher intensity mixed use. So looking at this kind of in the context of what's already on the ground in Hot Springs, we acknowledge that it might be a little bit more limited in its initial application on the city's zoning map. But it's useful to think of this as a tool, maybe even a back pocket district, to allow, as various parts of the community come online that might be appropriate for a higher intensity mixed use orientation, this could be a really effective way to get at that. And certainly we think more realistic than the current village district standard, which is really kind of a massive threshold at 40 acres to start playing with this mixed use concept. Further, the CG general commercial, which relates to the C2 general business. This one would allow for sort of a gamut of non-residential uses generally located on corridors or in tourist areas. And we've got the CR regional commercial related to the current C4. This is the big stuff. It's your IKEAs, it's your Walmarts, it's your Sam's Clubs, attracting a regional consumer base, often located along major commercial arterials or state roads, generating a lot of traffic. And then the CBD, the Central Business District, relates to the current C1. Again, this is the most intense development in Hot Springs. It should be predominantly, vertically mixed use. It should have some height to it. It should really encourage and reinforce the idea of pedestrian-oriented, active, vibrant downtown. Standards within the CBD district really ought to be oriented toward making sure that stuff that comes in is of high-quality design, and that the building forms are really matching and complementing the existing urban fabric that makes that part of Hot Springs truly unique. Looking at industrial districts, not many changes proposed here. Often with industrial, it's if it's not broke, don't fix it situation, and that's the case here. We have proposed to rename them I1 and I2 as opposed to M1 and M2, which is a more modern sort of nomenclature because not all industrial uses are manufacturing. One new one that is proposed is the IMU, the Mixed Use Industrial District. This one we found to be very useful in a number of communities. So it's generally applicable in areas that might be transitioning from industrial use. So say you've got a few industrial buildings that might have outlived their useful life for their original purposes, right? They can no longer serve as truly industrial structures, but they might be, more than suitable for a dog daycare or a CrossFit gym or a brewery or whatever, indoor soccer field that you want to put in there. So they may have outlived their sort of original useful life, but they can have a second life through provisions within something like an IM. These can also include some residential uses typically found above the ground floor. And again, just a really helpful, useful tool to encourage adaptive reuse of some really great older structures. Also recommending, similar to the residential and commercial, the controls within these districts should be updated, again, establishing building heights and removing FAR. Onto the special purpose and overlay districts. A lot of these kind of being maintained. First of those is the agriculture, forestry, and conservation, which we're just maintaining as current. We are recommending a new district, which is the institutional district. And this would really be to deal with larger campuses, so things like healthcare campuses, educational campuses, religious or governmental campuses, those types of places where you maybe want to give a little bit more flexibility toward the interior to allow them to grow in a way that makes sense and aligns with their needs and their mission, but you really want to be a little bit more sensitive to what happens around the edges where they interface with the rest of the campus. A specific district to deal with institutions can, and give them and you that flexibility. The H historic district is proposed to just become a reference within the zoning code, so that as people are working through, they know that historic district is out there and that it may have applicability or impacts on their proposed development. And then Malvern overlay, again, I already mentioned this. it's nice to think about the Malvern overlay not necessarily going away, but sort of dissolving into the fabric of the code overall in the commercial districts, because that's really what we're recommending. It's integration of that specific tool and those techniques into the way that the rest of the commercial districts handle design. So it's not going away so much as it's just becoming kind of a foundational element of the way we're dealing with it. The seasonal parking overlay, we're really proposing to move that out of zoning and into the city code. It's currently really functioning more as a permit, which is unusual for something to be included in zoning. And then finally, the VD Village District, mentioned already that 40-acre threshold. We're proposing to eliminate that one. We think that the new commercial district structure that we're proposing makes it a little bit obsolete. So, recommending. Okay, out of the world of uses and districts and into basically everything else that happens on a site within the zoning code. So thinking about general development standards here, we are making a number of recommendations for items of general applicability. So just for example, these could be things like site triangle standards, the clear sight at intersections and driveways to really ensure public safety, where vehicles and pedestrians often meet. What happens in conditions where you've got new development that's occurring on well and septic? How do we deal with that? And then including considerations for performance standards, so things like noise, heat, glare, dust, vibration, those types of nuisance controls. How can we build in a series of really sort of basic standards that are easy to understand, interpret, and enforce? Thinking about exterior lighting controls. So how do we begin to address things like glare onto adjacent properties? Not necessarily going, the full dark skies approach, but thinking about things like whether fixtures are shielded, how they're directed, how much light trespass is really allowed onto neighboring. So starting to get at controlling the impacts of exterior lighting community. Dealing with a full range of accessory structures. So just a few examples here. These could be things like detached garages and carports, mechanical equipment that is mounted on buildings, things like solar panels or residential scale wind turbines, or even a cold frame to overwinter some of your plants. So where can these things be located on the lot? How close can they be to the lot lines? How big can they be? Those types of controls need to be considered for a range of accessory structures. And the next few here really kind of deal with the unique environment in the hot springs, right? We don't have to deal with these everywhere, but where we do, it's a really important consideration. In visiting hot springs, we know that there's some steep slopes. We've walked them. So, the current subdivision ordinance defines a steep slope at 18%, so that's a good jumping off point for us, considering how to address these. And really the goal here is to see if we can work in regulations that would limit the extent of disturbance in steep slope areas within the city. These are really kind of sensitive environmental areas, and they can have a whole lot of impacts if they're overly disturbed. So we want to try and work some standards in relation to those. Similarly, waterfront buffers. How do we protect those critical environmental resources? Stop runoff? Is it a specific distance from those? How are we treating waterfront buffers to make sure that uses that not are potentially incompatible or not really approaching into those? And then finally, dealing with permitted obstructions. These are sometimes called permitted encroachments. These are either individual structures or features of buildings, so it could be a shed or a bay window. How are we allowing those to locate within required setbacks? How far can they encroach into required setbacks? If I've got a bay window on the front of my house, how far into my required front setback can that bay window obstruct or encroach? For off-street parking and loading, we really want to take a holistic look at how we're dealing with parking and loading within the city. So starting with design, how are we allowing parking facilities to locate related to structures in the street? Are we requiring that they're going to be behind, to the side? Are we allowing them between the buildings in the street? How are we dealing with parking lot configuration in terms of everything from the size of stalls to the required landscape islands to the size of drive aisles? And then dealing with parking structure design as well. So as new parking structures come in, how do we want those to contribute to the built environment of Hot Springs? Looking at things like access standards, stacking spaces, always a critical one for drive-through facilities. And then, you know, the new, the sort of COVID era, Uber era pickup drop-off space design. So the Uber drivers, the DoorDash guys, where are they going to sit and wait so that they're not obstructing traffic? And how are we going to deal with those types of access considerations? Looking at loading requirements in design for the types of uses that will require those, that will require loading, to make sure that we're designing a series of standards that really work for the uses and that don't contribute to congestion or create obstructions. And then thinking about some standards related to commercial vehicle storage, just a really basic set of standards to ensure that as commercial vehicles are stored, they're not creating any kind of undue impacts on their surroundings. More parking considerations. We're going to take a look at parking ratios. And really, one of the nice things about adjusting and modernizing the approach to uses is that it'll allow for the creation of a parking ratio table that's tied 1-to-1 to every use. So if a use is going to require parking, it will be listed right in that table. And it's just a much sort of clearer, more straightforward way to deal with parking. Also want to consider where it might make sense within the community parking maximums, so that we are not allowing every business within the community to design for, you know, the 2 days before Christmas when those lots are actually full, but that we're allowing a realistic amount of parking, but not over parking, where that would make sense. Thinking about things like parking flexibilities, potential exemptions for entire districts, like CBD obviously makes sense to not require parking. Also, exemptions for adaptive reuse. So if I am reusing a building for a commercial use and that building never provided parking because there was no room on the lot for it to provide parking, why would we try and require it to provide parking? They can't make space out of thin air. And oftentimes those types of exemptions can really serve to incentivize reuse of old grade structures that might otherwise just sit vacant because parking requirement. And then potentially also exempting a certain amount of square footage for certain uses. So say, you know, commercial uses under 2,500 square feet would be exempt from providing parking. So that's another consideration for parking. Also want to think about electric vehicles and how we're acknowledging those within the code moving forward, how we're encouraging that new developments, particularly larger developments, will consider including EV charging. And then finally, bicycle parking requirements. So we know that there are a lot of people riding bikes around Hot Springs. If they're riding them to a particular location, it just makes sense that that location would have a spot for them to park. So sensible requirements, obviously, akin to the vehicle parking, don't want to require too much. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging that that is a form of transportation that's used within the community. Kind of akin to thinking about parking is landscape. That's because a couple of the first things that we always think about when we think about landscape are parking lots. So how are the edges of parking lots, the perimeter right up against the right of way? How's the interior of the lot landscaped so that we're addressing things like heat island effects, stormwater runoff, as well as sort of the visual impact of parking at the public. Dealing with things like buffer yards, which could be required between potentially incompatible uses. So say I've got industrial up against residential. Industrial use might be required to put in a buffer yard that would have a fence, some screening, some shrubs, really mitigate just those basic impacts of things like noise and dust, and to help kind of transition between incompatible uses. These can also be tailored. It doesn't have to be sort of one blunt standard applied everywhere, so that as the uses change, the requirements for a buffer yard could change. Also thinking about tree preservation for trees over a certain size, so mature trees, and we're proposing to work with the urban forester to really develop a set of standards that work to encourage preserving existing mature trees within the community without removing into the realm of something that And then finally, encouraging stormwater management in all landscape design. This is something that we kind of bake in from the very beginning of the process here. Anywhere that we're requiring landscape, we want to be sure that we're being flexible enough so that people can do kind of alternative designs. If they don't want to put a curb up, they can sink it down so that it absorbs more stormwater that way. Providing that kind of flexibility for innovative design or just different design goals for we will be updating signs as well as part of this effort. We're proposing that signs get moved into zoning so that everything is kind of coordinated and working together. The first consideration in terms of any sign update nowadays is the issue of content neutrality. So there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases really over the past 10 years that have come down and established really strong case law that says you cannot have sign regulations anymore that regulate by any type of content. So essentially, you can't define sign types by what they say. So we're going to need to move forward, really evaluate all the sign types that are within the current code and make sure that they're all content. Moving forward with the full range, that should say full range of sign types. So dealing with everything from wall signs to pole signs to projected signs to blade signs, and making sure that we're addressing all of the varied categories of permissions for signs as well. So those that are permanent signs versus temporary signs, what's associated with getting one of those, where can it go, what types of signs can be permanent, what types of signs can be temporary, as well as those that are prohibited, and then those that either require a permit or just don't. And similar to the discussions that we've been having about the kind of tailoring the character of the commercial districts, we want to make sure that the signs and the sign types and the sizes also work to complement the architecture, work to complement the character and the form of the districts. And then lastly here, proposing some classic sign provisions. I think this Tom Moore photo here is actually a sign that's protected in Hot Springs. The idea here is that there may be a number of signs. It's often found in older communities where there are a number of signs that are great old signs that wouldn't meet the letter of a more modern sign code, but that the community wants to keep, the community wants to see maintained. Classic sign provisions can allow that to happen, can allow them to be relocated or reused, and really just kept in shape without being forced into disrepair and dilapidation. Also important to note here, as part of the sign code updates, we're not proposing at this point any updates to anything pertaining to buildings. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about, we're proposing a kind of a whole series of administrative modernizations. One of the most important ones is this idea of modernizing plan development. So what we're proposing is really an alternate approach, wherein plan development would no longer be applied as a district, but it would be applied more as a development approval. So it would sit on top of a base district. That approval would just sit on top of the base district and would modify what's allowed within that base district, similar to the way that PD works now. An interesting consideration here as well, and something that we're recommending, is that these plan development approvals can expire. So potentially after a period of time when no action is taken on an application, that approval will just sunset or expire. And this is actually a kind of a really useful tool to make sure that there's predictability, both in terms of anybody who is kind of invested in getting a PD approved, right? If I'm a neighbor and I've been part of the approval process, if I'm the person that was seeking to get the PD, if I'm city staff, there's predictability that we're not just going through the motions to get approval, but that we're kind of working toward a specific outcome. If that outcome doesn't materialize, then the approval expires and the base zoning district just the approval process for plan development would involve a pre-application meeting with staff that would be required, followed by an optional at the applicant's discretion concept plan before the planning commission, and then would move through the development for that. Important to note that under this way of looking at plan development, it would no longer be targeted specifically to infill, which is mostly how it's being used now to our understanding, but that it would really become more of a tool to allow for more innovative or unique development. So, and it kind of gets at the next bullet here, public benefits, which if the community, if the city wants to allow a little bit of leeway, a little bit of flexibility, to provide these modifications to the base zoning districts, there should really be a negotiation in terms of what the city is going to get in return. So we've introduced this idea of public benefits, and that land development really is a negotiation, right? So if we're going to give you extra height, we're going to give you a couple additional uses that aren't allowed within the base district. What is the city going to be getting back? So public benefits would be required, but flexible in their application. So for example, public benefits could be preservation or enhancement of open space, creating plazas, creating outdoor seating or public art, including some affordable housing as a component of the development. But also don't even need to be that rigid. If it's an affordable housing development, that might be considered the public benefit in and of itself. So really designed to be kind of a flexible negotiation. And then finally, looking at administrative minor and major changes after the approval. So looking to establish a series of thresholds at which different parties or bodies can take action to approve changes to an approved plan development. So the three thresholds being administrative changes that can be approved by the zoning administrator, minor changes approved by the planning commission, and then major changes approved by the board. So the intent here is that once things move into construction, after they're approved, there might be engineering snags, there might be particular site constraints that weren't evident at the time the plan was approved, and we need some sort of flexibility to make sure that we can allow those types of changes without forcing someone to go through the process. And within the technical review, you'll see that there are specific examples of what would be considered to meet each of these thresholds. And then we're also proposing a series of updates to nonconformities. One of those that I just want to highlight here would be a potential new permission. So this diagram is notoriously hard to understand, so I'm not really even going to talk to the diagram. We've given it a couple shots more recently, and I think we might have something better to actually include in the code. It's just difficult to understand conceptually. The way that it would work is essentially single family and two family that might have, a side wall or rear yard, or a rear wall that's projecting just a little too far into a required setback. But I want to extend, either laterally to meet the side of my house, or vertically to meet the top of my house. That we just allow that to happen, as long as it is within the same plane, it's not moving past anything. That we would just allow that to happen without forcing them to seek a variation. And the idea here is that a lot of this older housing stock often finds itself in the wrong place on a lot. And so providing this type of flexibility really encourages and incentivizes people to continue to maintain and improve these older homes, which are often some of the most affordable homes in the community. And so not forcing them through a variance process, but rather just allowing them to make these sensible, logical updates to their homes is an important thing to do. I think with that, it's been a lot of material and I kind of jumped around a little bit, but happy to kind of move forward and take any comments or answer any questions. Also just want to flag here the website for this project, which is codeforwardhfs.com.
Very good.
Okay, we have some time for questions.
We have questions. Director Garcia.
Yes, thank you. Is this document on this website, or can we get that? Okay.
It's on the website,
So we
yes.
can access it
Yes,
there.
there's actually some additional information on the website with the essentials of this.
Well,
Yeah.
okay,
We've
thank
got a
you.
copy of the PowerPoint as well. We'll get to
Yeah,
you.
I would like a copy of the PowerPoint. Thank you. And
So-
thank you, Chris and the
Yeah.
team. This is excellent work. And I love, love, love what you have proposed on the plan development. I think that will help our city a great deal. We have some that have approvals that are several years old. When this is adopted, would it become applicable to those that haven't done any construction in those
No.
years?
Uh,
They
no.
would be grandfathered
They-
in?
What we have now is PD as a zone district. This would eliminate any new establishing of PD as a zone district. For example, if you have land that is zoned R4 and you have something in mind that could best be handled with an alternative type of site plan, then you would have still your R4 zoning, but you have R4-PD. That dash PD is what could expire. Your zone district would stay as it was when you began. So this will establish kind of a bright line between those things that have been approved under our old code and those things that would be approved under this new code, whatever it says when we get it done and you decide that you would like to approve it. So,
And would that be something in consideration for when permits are obtained and no one does anything for years with that building permit, that we could have expiration dates?
that is part of another code,
Okay.
yes.
And on the lake property regarding lakefront and not lakefront, what was brought out about the limits on disturbance on the steep slope developments, often our lake properties are on steep slopes. So those type of considerations, I hope, would be applicable to whether it was right on the water or, you know, back a lot or two, because those are steep slopes and it still impacts the whole lake area. And that's part of our goal to preserve those, the environment in those areas with the least earth disturbances.
Yes, and we will be looking at those things as we move forward.
And I liked what was displayed on the cottage developments, but I wasn't sure which area that fit in, which are that would be one of the high densities, I guess.
Which development, I didn't
The
catch.
cottages, you know.
Cottage
there were-
courts, we have not determined what zone districts those would work in. And so that's something that you will see when we have our public draft presentation.
You know, where we have that housing between Golf Links and Carpenter Dam, it's actually called the cottages.
Yes,
I don't know if that was a separate zoning or what code, residential code that was, but that's similar
It is.
to what was reflected here. But I think that is something that would benefit our community as well.
it would provide another housing option.
Yes, yes. But I thought it was all very, very well presented, and I'm very encouraged with all of the work and the presentation. So I thank everybody involved.
Yeah, thank you.
Phyllis, I'm sorry. Phyllis, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mayor.
Director Beard.
Yes, my question was about the signs. Those signs were pertaining just to downtown. That he said that there weren't going to be any changes to the proposed billboard regulations. Okay, so like the Tom Moore cigar sign, that would stay.
The Tom Moore cigar sign actually is subject to our local ordinance in the historic district, the Central Avenue Historic District. That sign is an element of our historic district, so would not be covered by anything in the general zoning code.
Okay. I really like that sign.
It's priceless,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and then he said something about the signs that would be prohibited. What has to happen for a sign to be prohibited? Is that something that?
Can you be more specific about what you're wanting to know?
Well, I'm not for sure. This is just something that he mentioned. He said, like, sizes would be matched to district, and then some of the signs would be prohibited. So are there going to be lots of signs that are redone or replaced, or, and then?
The sign code typically, again, addresses new signs. So
Okay.
we wouldn't be necessarily going out and chopping down signs that don't
Okay.
agree with these. An example of a sign that would be prohibited at this time in the Malvern Overlay Zone District, the temporary signs are prohibited. So, I mean, that's an example of something prohibited now.
And I'll jump in, Kathy, too, and just say, again, just to say, we're not looking at amortizing any signs that are out there. So as these come in, signs that are out there are going to be legally non-conforming. Typically, things that would be considered prohibited signs are, say, balloon and inflatable signs, things that could blow away into the public right of way and cause a public safety issue. Signs that flash, signs that move. It's typically just sort of a whole series of provisions about, we don't allow these types of signs. So if they're flashing at cars, or if they're creating public safety considerations, we just prohibit those types of signs.
Director Beard, in the area of First Amendment, you have time, place, and manner.
Yep.
When it comes, since the ruling of Reed versus Town of Gilbert, content if you have to read the sign to regulate it, it's probably an unconstitutional regulation. So we don't deal with content at all. The time, place, and manner, we still have those avenues to look at the signs.
You said that, was that a Supreme Court?
It was.
Okay. Is that the same thing? Maybe I asked you about the political signs last year.
Yes.
Harmony, do you remember?
Well, that was part of the discussion, I'm sure.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
But again, that's more of the place. Political signs cannot be put in the public right of way. Political signs cannot be put on public property. But
Typically, political signs would be considered a content distinction, right? Because you need
Yes.
to look at the sign to determine that it's a political sign.
so it's more of the place.
Yep.
And if I could just jump in here, we don't allow signs on our public property, so it's not just political signs.
Good point.
Okay.
Any additional questions or comments?
I have one. It's probably a dumb one. He used that acronym FAR several times. I don't know what that means.
Ah,
I didn't know
the secret
that
language,
either.
the
Yes.
secret elitist language of planners. We shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
FAR is floor area ratio. It's something that we have in our code now, and it refers to the total number of square feet in a building. So if you had a 10 by 10 building, 1 story, it would be 100 square feet. And you would compare that square footage to the size of the lot, which we'll say is 100 by 100. So you divide that, you get a percentage, and that's your FAR, your floor area ratio. It's ridiculously hard to enforce, and I think Chris's comment that dimensional standards, such as saying stay in 20 feet from the edge of your property or don't exceed a certain height, is better at achieving the goals than just saying FAR, because FAR, you can put it anywhere on your property maybe and meet the ratio number, but you could be very disruptive to the overall character of an existing neighborhood in so doing. That was a great
There
question.
was another one too.
Director Webb?
I'm not sure I can top that FAR question. But it was helpful information because I, like Director Dobbs Smith, I don't think had a clue what FAR meant either. So that was informational. But I heard you mention enforcement, and I don't recall that being at least a focal point tonight as we were looking at the code forward plan. Are there going to be any amendments as to how this new plan may be enforced and what maybe consequential type action might be put in place for those who fail to abide by the new code?
I'm going to ask
And-
you the same question I asked Director Beard. Can you tell me what it is you want to know?
Well, let's say there's some policy or regulations for residential lake, and somebody chooses not to abide by those. I know it's always, the city's intention is to gain compliance for those, and there are many cases where there may be some residents, especially as we present a new code, who may be unaware of what that policy is and how they are to abide by it, whether it be residential or commercial. So would it still be the standard for the city of Hot Springs to approach those maybe policy violations with a warning at first and more of an educational piece to encourage compliance, and then follow that up with consequential type action? And
Yeah,
what might that
absolutely.
look like?
That's
consequential
what we
action?
do now.
Okay.
That is our procedure. We begin with education, then a notice that describes how compliance can be achieved, and we will continue to work with the property owner or tenant or, whoever is responsible, until it's clear that compliance is not going to happen. If the person is unwilling to comply, then a citation may be issued. Very rare. It's very
Right.
rare. And I think, too, we want to look at that. We talked slightly toward the end there about non-conforming. If you conformed with an old code, then you still are lawful. We're not going to,
Right, the new code doesn't affect what was once in place and was being conformed with.
right,
It's anything new.
it is
After
anything
this
new.
is adopted and passed.
That's correct.
And it's legit. Where might someone go to see what those consequential actions are for each of the, would that be on our website? Or is it kind of scenario-based?
So-
Again, I'm being very vague
Yeah,
because
so-
I don't know a specific occurrence, but I do deal with some constituents of mine who sometimes have issues with those around their business or, neighborhood, and they want to see compliance, so they reach out to me, and the city does very good to respond to those requests and provide that educational aspect. But then there are some cases where even with that educational aspect, nothing is done
Sure.
to make those corrections. So where might somebody go to look to say, hey, step one, this is what we do. Step two, this is what happens.
I'll try to approach that a different route. First of all, with respect to new development, if it's under this new code, those provisions are enforced by the denial of permits. If you do not fit the zoning, if you do not fit the FAR, if you don't, whatever it might be, the setbacks, you don't get your building permit. You don't get your water permit.
Right.
With respect to properties that are lawful pre-existing non-conforming uses, as long as it was conforming under the code in which they created, which they developed, they're able to continue to do so. If they're not, then we have a general penalties provision within our code, just like every other violation of ordinance. They can be cited and fined after they've been spoken to. In some instances, that's not practical. And so there are circumstances where I have sought mandatory injunction on issues. For example, having a manufactured home removed from a lot where it didn't belong, to get an order to do that. Another example is violation of the zoning code for apartments in a residential area where they could not establish that they had a lawful pre-existing non-conforming use. I'm shocked that they weren't able to prove it, but they weren't. In any event, court order to shut down that operation and return to residential use only. Single family residential.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you.
Director Garcia.
Piggybacking on that, also, if it's a current construction project and they it's part of their requirement to prevent the stormwater runoff, and they meet with them, and then they still don't put it in place to prevent that, they can have a stop
Absolutely.
order to, yeah.
Yep.
To not continue any work until they do that work to prevent
That is
that
right.
runoff from going out and causing other problems.
And
too.
that is in addition to the possibility of fines.
Right. But that causes, when they lose
That,
time.
that gets their attention.
Yeah, that gets their attention when they, time costs money.
Director Holliday?
Thank you. First of all, I can tell this is a phenomenal amount of work, so thank you guys, all of you guys under that umbrella. One of the things I was really excited to see in the beginning, because my constituents, the thing that I've heard more than anything are those who are trying to do whatever, renovations, building, and whoever is working on it, it may feel inconsistent or confusing, depending on who it is that's coming to speak with you all in the planning office. So the fact that the increasing the transparency and the expediting of approvals, I think is incredibly important, and the fact that that's first and foremost with everything else, I think is good. And I think it'll solve some of the concerns that Director Webb was saying, that depending on what this manual is, what's in it, it's going to save me hours that I've spent trying to help people dig through the code. So I love that that's there. The only thing that jumped out to me that seems like it may be a little difficult is the number of residential zones. And I get why they're all there, but that just seems like a lot of residential zones. And so if there's any kind of information or conversation you can lend to that.
Well, I think the addition of zones, first of all, looks at the enormous space that there is between the current R1 zone at 1 acre and the next size, which is 12,000 square feet. And, you know, that is a big jump. And there are a lot of people who don't want to take care of 1 acre, among other things, or don't want to spend the money for that much land. So the residential estate provides a little bit of additional possibility there when someone is subdividing land. The number of zones, you know, I wish there were maybe 4. That would be great. But I learned about 40 years ago that you need to look up the answers in order to be correct anyway. And we're not trying to carry all these things in our brains. There'll be a table that explains it, and I think we've added some smaller size lots that respond to a comment that we got probably more than any other comment when we did our stakeholder interviews, is that in order to provide an affordable product for citizens of Hot Springs to be able to afford that and to have home ownership, or to be able to rent something even that's affordable, we can't require the large lot size that we're requiring now. It is two conflicting things. If you want to make something affordable on the end product, you can't require investment in more of a commodity at the beginning. So that's, we have added the estate option, and at the other end, we've added smaller lot options that should allow for us to get in there and implement that housing strategy that we're trying to do at the same time that we're doing this.
So when
And I can just jump in too at these. So working all around the country, I think what we have found over time is that there's no magic number. That's the right number of residential zones, right? I mean, the right number of residential zones is the least amount that acknowledges all of the kind of varied characters that you want and have and need to reinforce. And I think that ultimately that's the key, right? So we want to both acknowledge and reinforce the character of existing areas of the city that are that are important and that we want to maintain. And we also need to develop a series of new tools to implement policies that are coming out of the comprehensive plan, whether those are to allow, more density in targeted areas or to develop smaller lot residential districts. And so, the right amount of tools in the toolbox is just, it's the amount that you need. I totally understand. It looks like a lot. Comparatively, you guys are, relatively constrained or relatively restrained, I think, in terms of the number of residential districts. We have seen far more, just like we've seen far fewer.
Well, and moving forward, all of our properties will get rezoned into the new code. So I'm imagining we'll have a lot of kind of checkerboarding in some neighborhoods, or we'll just have to choose that that the zone would be the step down or the step up, whatever would be the next density. Because I know when things come to us typically, and also the Planning Commission, we try to keep those sort of squarer lines, so we don't have little keyholes everywhere, but I'm imagining in order to put this over everything, it's gonna be maybe a little messier before it's cleaner.
Yeah, I think there will be some creativity involved in looking at that map. One interesting thing that we may not have emphasized enough in our presentation is that the existing city is older. The subdivisions in the older neighborhoods occurred before we had zoning, and a huge proportion of the existing zoned neighborhoods are they don't meet the zone district that they're in. And so it makes it very complicated for someone who wants to do an improvement to their home or something like that. They're already non-conforming. This cleans some of that up too.
Well, and I know it'll allow for some more of that infill, because that's a huge issue, particularly on the north end of town, that lot size just isn't there
Yeah.
to build at all.
That's true.
And so, that is encouraging with having those more dense zones that hopefully some of those small lots can then be built on. So, thank you.
Yeah. I think we're all saying the same thing. I mean, it's no surprise we don't have 40-acre tracts of land in order to build a gridded subdivision like you would want. But the biggest complaints that I ever hear are the lot sizes on vacant lots. It's not economically feasible to develop them because of the setbacks, so that can be alleviated. And making renovations to existing homes end up violating the setbacks in existing subdivisions that have been zoned, whatever they've been zoned, and they don't meet them.
Right.
So we need to make it easier for people to reinvest and revitalize what we have here.
Amen.
Any further questions? If not, I want to thank Chris for his work and efforts along with our planning and development team, and we appreciate all that you've done, and we look forward to continuing the evolution, I guess, of this process and
Exactly.
in our zoning.
Yeah. See you after the holidays with
We're on the right.
public draft.
Sounds like we're on the right track, though.
Yep. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chris,
Thanks, Rob.
if you're still
Yes.
there.
I'm still here. Thanks, everyone.
Camiris has been a great partner, so we look forward to a outstanding product.
Thank you for driving the ship on the Zoom. That was awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye now.